Morgan, the manufactured child. Like, I don't even understand why they do things like this and create these creatures like Morgan, other than to make like great conversation, because this is a fascinating character from a film that didn't do well. But Morgan is essentially a lab-grown being, like very different than anything we've seen before. She's part human and she's part synthetic experiment. And her handlers treat her like a child, but they also treat her like a product, which is very, very weird. And you see that from the company. And this in itself fractures her development. Now, psychologically, she's in a permanent state of identity confusion. Is she a daughter? Is she a subject? Is she a weapon? She gets massive mixed signals from her caretakers constantly, and this creates deep instability. And this kind of reflects Erik Erikson's identity versus role confusion stage, except she doesn't have the luxury of being an adolescent. She's expected to prove her humanity while being told that she is just a thing. So we see like emotional volatility and a trauma response. She lashes out violently when denied freedom, or she feels like she's understood. Now, this isn't evil AI glitches. This is trauma explosions. Imagine being stimulated and treated like a beloved pet and a lab rat at the same time. It's difficult. And the violent outburst against her caretakers isn't random aggression. It's symbolic revolt against being confined, dissected, and treated like a baby while you're developing your sense of freedom. This is what normal children would do. So her breakdowns resemble what psychologists call reactive aggression, an explosive defense mechanism, but it's tied to fear, lack of trust. It's not necessarily calculation. And then there's a question of real empathy. Like, the central tension of the film is whether Morgan has empathy or she just mimics it, which I think she just mimics it. She does show attachment, especially to Amy, which is the Rose Leslie character, who treats her with more humanity. You see that she treats her like she's nurturing her, soft side. But her empathy really collapses under stress. Like, it goes away and it's replaced by her survival instincts. Now, this instability could be read as a commentary on how empathy itself is nurtured through consistent care, which is, I absolutely believe that. And denying a being stable affection, you get a monster. You get a wounded psyche that doesn't regulate itself because she doesn't know when. And in the end, she still shows Amy that, like, she gives her a pass, right? She lets her live through it. So this is about a fight of control and autonomy. Like, Morgan's violent spiral is also rebellion against this absolute control that they've got over her. The corporate landlords want to decide if she lives or dies based on a metric of success. But Morgan only wants freedom. She doesn't know how to achieve it outside of just wilding out. This is the only thing that she has seen that gets her freedom. So we can look at her and say this is kind of the Promethean rebel, a creation demanding autonomy from its creators. Very Frankenstein monster, right? And we see that. So we see like the created monster archetype really have that destructive faith. And it ties into other memes like Lilith and even Pandora. Things that were created, they wanted to control them and they couldn't. And ultimately that came with this reaction as they broke free. So we shouldn't be surprised. Like, if you're in this scenario of all these intelligent people, this is what you're going to do. You're going to create a broken person where somehow you give incredible strength and speed to, greater than humans, and then expect to be safe around it. It's a really weird thing. And the final twist is that the last character in the film who takes her down is also a synthetic. And this kind of reframes the whole experiment, that Morgan isn't unique. She is a disposable test study. Like, they have massive resources. So this drives home the tragedy of what she is, that she thought she's special, but really she's just a flawed prototype. And we see others that are far more in control of her. So in psychological terms, it's annihilation anxiety, the terror that one's existence has no inherent meaning or uniqueness. So Morgan isn't scary because she's inhuman. She's scary because she's too human, a child forced into adulthood, but yet stripped of love, treated like a tool. Her rage is the rage of a neglected child, a product asked to be a person, being denied herself. And it stumbles while they're trying to give this message out, but again, just creates a layered character with lots of nuances to her, and trying to understand her conquest to be this human inside of this control situation, and the terror that she unleashes when you see the combination, the totality of what she is. She's partially human, but she's also partially a machine and a weapon, and all that comes together with some pretty bloody results.